Understood.
Well, welcome to the Duty to Warn podcast. I'm your host, John Gartner, and today our guest is Dr. Suzanne Lachmann, a private practice New York licensed psychologist, clinical psychologist. She also has a blog on Psychology Today, Me Before We, and since 9/11, she's been a consultant to the New York Fire Department. Well, one of the things that we get criticized for in Duty to Warn is that we're diagnosing someone that we haven't examined. But as a native New Yorker who's lived in New York all her life, you have had personal contact with Donald Trump that has informed your professional assessment of him. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the history of your contacts with Donald Trump and how it's helped shape your understanding of who he is?
Absolutely. Us New York City residents who grew up in the 80s and 90s in particular had Donald Trump in our periphery throughout the time that he was sort of building up his empire in New York. During that period of time, he was often on the Howard Stern show, and I was a big Howard Stern fan, so pretty much listened to every interview that he had done.
And
it
was
a
lot there. You know, I don't know if people have really combed through those interviews.
When you do, you will find that because because the conversations were so admiring of the Donald and his accomplishments, there was no reason at that point to criticize him. He was making an empire. We didn't really have access to how many people were alienated, for example, because he had a tendency not to pay his workers. The people he contracted to help build his buildings, people who installed air conditioning systems, etc., often were shortchanged by him. The bigger he got, the less he did to give back to the people that helped him to get there. However, that was not, nobody was really aware at that level yet. I certainly wasn't. He seemed like a reasonably thoughtful-ish person when he'd go on the Stern show. And
he did joke about being able to go into the dressing room of the Miss Teen USA pageant. That part we did learn, right?
We did. In a sort of congenial environment with Howard Stern, who...
That was locker room talk.
It was, Howard was so adoring. At that time, Howard was married and sharing in no uncertain terms how envious he was when anyone had access to beautiful women. So the Donald, as we all knew him, didn't necessarily initiate those conversations, but Howard would sort of coax him into discussing that kind of locker room talk. Back then, though, censorship was still pretty rigorous, so conversations were more carefully worded. You didn't get the kind of intense harshness the way that you do now in the way you hear him speaking or the kinds of things you heard him saying in the last few years. Back then, he was easier to listen to and even kind of enjoyable to listen to. In retrospect, however, it becomes clear that he was easy to listen to because Howard was a forum of adoration for him.
Makes sense.
There was no challenge whatsoever to how he conducted himself, what practices he used, what ways he may have alienated people along the way. There was adoration, as I said before, including how when he had lost everything and rebuilt himself, I think in the 80s or 90s, again, the ways in which he regathered his wealth were not, how he got there wasn't as important as the fact that he was a socialite, that he was in this sort of socioeconomic stratosphere that other people could only dream of being. I'm sure he was on a Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous episode back in the day. He was certainly known around New York. And as a result, my first encounter with him was in the 90s, early 90s, after I had seen a number of his or not seen, but heard a number of his interviews. And it was at Missoni, who's a fashion designer. It was a benefit that Missoni. And it was particularly memorable because he and his first wife, Ivana, had just gotten divorced, or it had become public like the day before. So it was a very interesting time to be casting eyes on him for the first time, the day after his divorce had been final and had been in the papers. And I, feeling like I had, like so many other New Yorkers, already had some semblance of a relationship with him because of having heard him so many times on Stern, and not yet putting together that he was going to be abrasive or difficult because he had always been amenable on Stern. At the function, he made an entrance shortly after Ivana came in, and he was sort of, when I say sort of skulking in the corner, I'm not kidding. He didn't seem comfortable with people who surrounded him or came up to him. He seemed very into being isolated, wanted nothing to do with anyone. I wondered if it had to do with being upset that there was his ex-wife on the other side of the room and they were both at this function. Oh. So when I had my opportunity to go up, I thought I would say something supportive, something positive about how well he came off in his interviews and how charming he seemed to be. And when I went up and introduced myself, before I even had a chance to go further than, hi, I just want to introduce myself, he interrupted me. Excuse my language, it was jarring to me too. And he looked at me and he said, why would I want to bother to talk with you? Look where we are. There's so many beautiful women here. I wouldn't even let you suck my dick.
Oh my God.
So that was my first encounter with Donald Trump.
That's quite a first opening line.
Yeah. Yep, it was. And it was obviously upsetting and a bit confusing. So I didn't push it past that point. I
yeah, what do you say? What's the comeback for that?
Right. It was also an insult, that I didn't match the physical level that was deserving of his attention.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's really so much in that very abrasive statement that we could kind of unpack, right? It's a bullying, attacking, devaluing kind of statement. It's also a grossly sexist, objectifying of women statement, and it's a very self-aggrandizing statement. It's kind of got all of these things all kind of rolled up into that one moment. And it also sounds like the way someone would talk who was a serial abuser of women.
Especially because, in my mind at that time, there was Ivana in the same room, and they had children together, they'd been married for a long time. We're talking the 20th century, So divorce was a bigger deal than it's considered to be now, in many circles at least. And I felt, when I was walking up to him, I felt some compassion for him, that it must be difficult to be in this room with his now ex-wife the day after they got divorced, or that the divorce was final. So to be insulted in that way, and have, while she thinking that he's going to be uncomfortable or sad or whatever the case may be, awkward because of this scenario, to know that that was the furthest thing from his mind, and rather it was, I don't want to bother with you, you are not attractive enough for me to bother with, and not only am I going to inform you of that, I'm going to really inform you of that by saying something tremendously inappropriate and cruel.
Well, one of the things that, when I've talked about him having a malignant narcissism, the four components of malignant narcissism are narcissism, paranoia, antisocial personality disorder, and sadism. And I think the fourth component, sadism, is very important. Because he brushed you off in a way that was maximally calculated to be as hurtful and humiliating and devaluing as possible for someone he's never met.
Right.
He has nothing reason to be. He has nothing against you. You haven't done anything to him. It's gratuitous. It's a kind of first response. Let me just crush you into the dirt, you anonymous person who I don't even know.
Right. Right. Especially because we were at the same charity function.
Right.
It was not a huge function. So, and I chose a moment when he wasn't talking with anyone else. He was alone. And we didn't have cell phones back then. So I wasn't disturbing him while he was communicating with somebody. And I was approaching him because I felt some level of compassion for him. And yeah, so having that encounter with him was jarring, although he was not considering anything political at that time. So that memory went back into my brain somewhere, not to be dug up again until many years later when it became more relevant. But it did give me insight into what and whom we were dealing with from early on.
Well, maybe you could say more about that, and how that insight developed and how you began to understand what this guy was about.
Because of my history as a New York City resident and a Donald Trump neighbor, and as I mentioned before, he was on page 6 of the society section of the Times very often, and often on Stern. And I had friends who knew his kids or knew him. So he was very much in the social circles, many of which I ran in. The thing that we knew, or many of us who knew him knew early on, was that this is a guy who made skyscrapers and lived in them, didn't come down often, didn't sort of hobnob with the regular folk, literally stayed in a glass tower above everybody else. And consequently, people who weren't in his immediate vicinity, or that he wasn't in some way engaged with, didn't have much meaning to him. He didn't develop, he didn't appear, based on the kinds of feedback I got from patients through time, or from people who knew him from time, coupled with my own experience. He didn't appear to have much ability to care for or consider how anyone else might be impacted by his decisions or his behaviors.
Well, when his history of sexual assault came out with the Access Hollywood tape and the victims came forward, did that ring a bell for you? Did that bring you back to that moment? Because it seems very consistent with that character who came out in the Access Hollywood tape.
There were so many ways that he had already rung bells for me prior to that Access Hollywood tape. I was already in full throttle fear for our country that this person who perhaps at an earlier time in his life had some semblance of a conscience, some semblance of compassion or empathy for others, since those muscles were never exercised. There was no reason for them to be in his life. He had people to do his dirty work. He, when buildings were raised so that his complexes could be raised, it was other people doing the work. He didn't have to deal with the aftermath or how people were affected. When there were oftentimes through the years when our various mayors sort of had to force his hand to get him to either do improve infrastructure in New York, like, okay, if we're going to allow you to build this building, then you're going to have to improve the pier on 79th Street. And he would take these acts on kicking and screaming as if he shouldn't have to do anything that he didn't feel like doing. And again, because he literally was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, not literally, but might as well have been, there was no recourse. And that was perplexing, that no matter what, he seemed untouchable. I remember one patient I worked with who came in crying because her father had, and this was independent of, again, of any knowledge of what he was going to become. This is probably in early on in my practice, so maybe 15 or so years ago, crying because her father had installed air conditioning units in Trump's buildings, and he had elected or just ignored payment, and she couldn't see me anymore because her father was not being paid for the work that he and his men had done for Trump.
Interesting.
Through the course of time, that's what's so mind-boggling in many ways about the extent to which people rigorously defend him now. That especially anyone who may be from New York who might defend him now, that he was widely known for ripping people off, for not giving a shit about anyone but himself. And the fact that he would just sort of be unwilling to pay people for the work that they were doing when it was for him, over and over and over again. I don't know how many lawsuits that he has settled up to this point, but there are so many more disenfranchised workers throughout New York, New Jersey, and beyond, where he's built hotels, where he's built buildings that people live in, that have not received reimbursement to this day from him. So that kind of lack of sticking to your word,
and sticking it to the working man, which is supposedly the people who supported him. Right.
That part is utterly mind-boggling to me. How that can be so readily forgotten or disacknowledged or excused. So if you add the fact that he could basically do what he wanted without any repercussions, and then the other piece of this that I think really needs to be built into the picture of who he is the amount of years that he spent on his show The Apprentice. I believe it was 12 years that he did The Apprentice. And if you look at the way that show is conducted, it is episode after episode of him sitting in a boardroom playing God. And
just thought about his first cabinet meeting that everyone was making fun of because everybody had to stumble all over themselves to fawn all over him. Think about that as
that's familiar territory
a weird
for him.
Version of The Apprentice now come to the White House.
Exactly. But when you are already isolated and stuck in your own narcissism, because there's no way to dilute it, no one who can bring you down to earth. And then you, on top of that, have a show that is airing for 12 years, filmed day after day, week after week, episode after episode, is him being the entire decider on every person's fate. And what they're lucky enough to come away with is a job with him. So there's a lot written about, although I don't know how much of it people can still access, but there's a lot written about how abusive he was behind the scenes. Much of even that interaction he had with me is no different than how he treated so many of the potential apprentices that came through.
Right, he wasn't just having a bad day in that interaction with you. We now know it's in character.
Right. He's never, doesn't seem to ever be in a position to recognize that there's something to apologize for, or something to feel badly about, or some way that he should conduct himself that is more appropriate than what he does. When those muscles of being human, of engaging with people, of reading them and having them read you so that you can better understand each other and access each other's emotional lives, when none of those muscles are used and basically you're able to direct people at whim to do your bidding, there's no way any of us could come away from that kind of a scenario unscathed. So a whole lifetime of literally being in a tower, untouched by humanity, and then being able to orchestrate outcome after outcome on his show, it led him to, it really set the stage.
It fed
for
his
him.
Grandiosity that he should be in complete control.
The extent, yes.
And his antisocial, that he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it. Those two things, that he should be the star, he could be the star, he could be omnipotent and untouchable. Right.
I think, and I know that other people have, and these are certainly not mutually exclusive, that he's delusional as a result. Having solidified his belief system that he's untouchable, that he's godlike, that he deserves to be president, and made that happen. I know I didn't run for president because I didn't think I should or could, but that level of entitlement and fearlessness, I guess you can call it, because doesn't have a concept of what it feels like to deal with consequences, to deal with what happens on ground level with humanity. He's been so high up in his own isolated glass house, throwing stones from up there.
The people who live in glass houses can throw stones down at the peasants. Well, a lot of people have said that really, his life experience up until now has been so protected that he was able to create an environment where he was constantly getting his grandiosity fed.
And he created it himself.
Yeah, and so he's insulated from criticism, insulated from attacks, insulated from consequences, and constantly, as one person pointed out, living in a gilded environment. Literally everything has to be gold, and he has to be larger than life. That is the state under which he has sort of homeostasis, like you said, that he could be charming on the Stern show. He is not equipped then to deal with what happens when you are president, which is that you're criticized by everyone, or many people will criticize you. Many people have different agendas or different ideas that they want to try to convey to you or about you. He was completely unprepared. It's like someone that didn't have an immune system because they'd lived in a bubble.
Right.
Suddenly being exposed to all these pathogens. He can't handle it.
Right. That's right. It's wild and surreal to watch this person who has literally been able to have others do his dirty work and has literally, prior to the presidency, been able to orchestrate all the outcomes in his life the way that he wanted them to turn out, with signed off with adoration and paying homage to him. There's no other way to understand him other than to see him as devoid of an emotional life and just about feeding his ego and building what belongs to him, and building up what belongs to him, even at the expense of the rest of us.
So you can run a real estate empire with a boardroom of yes men. Because after all you have to do is buy land and materials and make buildings,
and in his case, not pay your workers and not care about the garbage you leave behind,
right? Or your loans or your investors.
That's
or whomever. Right. But there's no consequences for that. They're just screwed and tough luck. And so he's trying to recreate that environment in the White House with these adoring cabinet members who are fawning all over him. And that's just crazy. That's not how the presidency works. It's not a group of yes men just telling you how wonderful you are. It's a group of mature experts who are working with you as a team to deliberate and consider all the information to make the best decisions. But I think what you're pointing out for us, or what you're helping us to understand, is that Donald's life before politics is something that we haven't experienced, those of us who haven't been living in New York as you have, and haven't had personal contact with him as you have. But it's a little easier to understand why his mind is being blown and why he's sort of decompensating and getting paranoid in an atmosphere that is so radically different than the one that he has created.
He's not had this. He's been able to not be exposed, to fend off this level of exposure, and he's had control over his environment. He can't to the extent that he did, and that is certainly causing a mental implosion for him. We can see it every day, whether it be Kofifi or I flashed to recently a patient was recalling a contact he had when he was younger with Eric Trump. They had been on an ice hockey team or something, and my patient had elbowed Eric, and Eric's response was, "Don't you know who I am?" So every
level
aspect
of entitlement, it just runs right through the family.
It's mind-blowing.
Can't
Yes.
be treated like another hockey player. You have to be treated like some kind of plutocrat.
Right.
Maybe let him win.
Right. Don't you know who I am? That should be written on the back of the Trump jersey. You shouldn't need to know my name. Don't you know who I am?
Yeah.
So it's exhausting, because fine if we do need to know who the president is, but to some degree he needs to know who we are too. We're the constituents he represents. It's not realistic to represent constituents when your entire life has been at the top of a tower and you have not had to have access to actual people. He shows his distaste, his disdain for people who aren't, that he deems unattractive. He shows his disdain for people who aren't in the same economic echelon as him. The only people he doesn't show his disdain for, and that's at a distance, are people who are pro-Trump. But if he got in the same room with the majority of people that still to this day support him, he would be physically appalled, disgusted, overwhelmed, because the common folk, whether they support him or not, are tremendously distasteful to him.
Right. They're not even good enough to, you know what. Well, this has really been fascinating. Really interesting to hear a side of his life firsthand that other of us don't know. And it actually helps us fill in a piece of the picture that he used to live in a glass tower, and now in a sense he does live in a glass house. That you are not insulated from from criticism, and your grandiosity cannot be continuously stoked living in the White House the way it can living in Trump Tower.
That's right.
So, well, thank you very much for talking to us.
You're very welcome.
All right. I'll talk to you later. All right. Bye-bye.